Hey, did you know that the National Garden Bureau has declared this the year of the dahlia? It's great news for me because frankly every year in my garden is the year of the dahlia because this is one of my favorite flowers and today I'm planting some up. So today I am planting up these tubers into containers because I'm going to get a little bit of a head start on the season. Now I live in zone 5, so I'm not able to plant dahlias out until late May usually. So this allows me to get a little jump start on the season, get my plants growing, and then I transplant them into the garden when the soil is warm enough for me to do that. You can, however, plant your dahlia tubers straight into the ground, but you have to make sure that the soil is warm enough. So a pretty good general rule of thumb is that if it's warm enough to plant your tomatoes out, it's probably warm enough to plant your dahlias out. Just make sure that you're not planting your dahlias into cold, wet soil because they will not appreciate that behavior at all. I'm going to show you how I'm planting up a couple of things. First, I'm going to start with a new tuber that I got new this year, and then I'll show you how I divide and plant up an old tuber. But basically, the process is really simple, and it's not really any different if you're planting in the ground. If you're planting your dahlias straight into the ground, you plant them at the same depth, you do everything the same. You don't have to do a lot of amending to your soil, except make sure that you have good drainage in your soil. And if you don't, you want to do a little bit of amending to make sure that your soil has good drainage because they want to be moist, but they don't want to be sitting in wet. So the first one I'm going to plant up is a new one because it's a little easier, to one less step if you're starting with new tubers. This is a new one I'm doing this year. This is called Dahlia Breakout. I've been wanting to plant this one, so I'm very excited about it. These are from Longfield Gardens. This is no matter where you order dahlias from, or even if you buy them at the garden center, they will probably come wrapped in some sort of bag with some air holes in it and then in peat moss. There's 3 tubers in this bag. So you just kind of gently open them up because they are a little bit fragile. And this is a great one because if you can see, there's a great eye on this, which is already swelling and developing. So it's very easy to tell that this tuber is going to produce stems and flowers and leaves and do its thing because it's got everything it needs to do that. So here's the easy part. All you need to do is plant these in a container. I use gallon containers left over from when I buy. I save all my pots when I buy plants. I tend to use them all. I save everything. And just plant it into there. I am using, and this is the key, you want to use a potting mix that does not have fertilizer in it. Dahlias will not appreciate it if you use a potting mix that already has fertilizer in it. So I am using a very cheap grower's mix. This is what all the garden centers near us use to plant up their own containers. It's a peat-based, very light and fluffy mix that has no fertilizer mixed into it. I sort of look at potting mixes a lot like when I'm baking. I like to use unsalted butter so I can control how much salt goes into the recipe. It's sort of the same thing for me with potting mixes. I like to add things. So I start with a pretty basic potting mix, which is extremely affordable. And then I just add in what I need, which is usually fertilizer. Sometimes there's a few other things. In this case, you don't have to add anything. Use it straight out of the bag. So I have filled up the bottom of this container with a couple inches of potting mix. And you want to plant these so that the eyes, which is where the neck and the tuber meets, are maybe 2 to 3 inches below the soil. Sometimes it's a little hard to do if you have a really big tuber when you're planting in these. So I just do my best. And then I can always raise the level of soil when I actually plant them out in the garden. Then you just set them on their sides. They don't have to be really centered in the pot. They're not living in these pots for very long. This is a very temporary situation. And then you just need to top that off with some soil mix. And you don't need to fill the whole pot up. I mean, I don't if I don't have to because you're just saving soil. There's no reason to use this as, like I said, you don't need to spend a lot of money on potting mix for this. Okay, that's in there. Only thing left to do after that is write a label, because I will tell you that all dahlias look the same until they start flowering, and you can't really move them once they do that, so you're sort of stuck with what you have. So if you get them mixed up and you plant one where you didn't mean to, it kind of is a bummer because you're stuck with that for the whole summer. Okay, that is how you plant up a brand new tuber. Now I'm going to talk to you about how you plant up the tubers that you might have saved. So I'm not going to talk to you about how to overwinter dahlias at this point, because that's a whole video onto itself, and there's a lot of different ways. I have tried most of them, some with more success than the others. But here's how you divide, and I like to divide my tubers in spring versus fall. It's easier to see the eyes. So here's how you go about doing that. So I want to show you how to divide dahlia tubers. You don't have to do them every year, but you probably should do them every 2 years or so. So I like to divide mine in spring rather than fall, because it's all about finding where the eyes are, and it's easier to see the eyes in spring. And you can see this one, this is HS Flame. It's a lovely red single with dark foliage. It's beautiful. Blooms all year long, well, all summer long if you keep deadheading it. But you can see there's really nice eyes that are starting to actually bud out here. There's 3 on that stem. And if you flip it over here, you can see there's a couple right there. So this is a really easy one to show you. So what I basically want to do is just divide these 2 stems. I might, oh my gosh. Normally you have to cut this, but I think I'm going to be able to sort of jostle this apart a little bit. So I have a nice, oh, this is really actually a nice easy one to show you. So they're sort of coming apart. What you want to make sure is you have at least 1 eye and 1 tuber per section. So I'm going to have to, you can use a knife, you can use a bypass pruner. That came apart beautifully. Now, if I wanted to, I could further divide this by cutting this stem in half. And here, maybe I will do that anyways. Oh, the other thing I do here is I just sort of clean, this is straight out of storage. So what I do is I clean up all these little wispy roots. You don't need any of that stuff. You can even cut off those guys. Just to clean them up a little bit. You don't need any of that stuff. It's not going to do any good this year. So I clean up all those little wispy roots that are stuck in there. If there's any damaged tubers, these all feel really good. Any damaged tubers or any tubers that are soft or a little squishy, I cut that root in half. I take those off. So this stem, you can also cut these stems back farther. I leave them a little longer because it's a little easier to handle, but you can cut those all the way back to here. So this one I'm going to leave, even though I could, do you see how there's eyes right there and there's an eye there? I could cut this down the center and have 2 dahlias. I'm not going to do that in this case because I don't really actually need a ton more of these, and I think that'll be fine for it. That'll get nice healthy growth. On this one, I think I will try to show you how to do that just so you can see. Basically what you want to do is aim to cut down the center. You definitely want to leave these tubers attached on this side and maybe even this one. So you have to, it's a little bit of surgery. This, by the way, is probably what they call the mother tuber. That's the tuber that these started from. And if you can cut that out, you can, because you don't need that anymore. That tuber is not going to produce anymore. So I am going to try to sort of bridge the gap here. You know, you do run, you don't really want to, okay, the knife's not going to cut it, literally. Some people use like a really big, like a chef's knife for this. That works. There. Okay, there. That worked great. So you see now we've got all these eyes. We've got enough tubers there. And we've got 1 eye over here. And there's tubers connected to that. And I will just cut out this little dried up bit. So now, from 1 plant, I got 3 plants. So we've got 2 more. I can pot them up. I can give them away. I can keep growing more dahlias. But we're ready to plant from here. Okay, now that you've got your tubers divided, you just plant them in exact, there's no difference between that and what you just bought at this point. So you just plant them up the same way. And in this case, there's still a bit of a root here, and this could make it difficult to fit in the pot. I'm just going to pop that off. Stick that in the pot. cover it up. Now, if you're using potting mix that's fairly moist straight from the bag, you don't need to add any water to these at all. Dahlias don't really need or want water until they start growing, but they do need, you don't want them to dry out. Sometimes a very dry potting mix can almost suck the water out of them. So you don't want to do that. But hopefully if your potting mix is relatively fresh out of the bag, there's enough moisture in it already. If you need to add a little bit of water to moisten it, go ahead and do that. Just don't soak the whole pot. Then what I do with these pots is I just pile them up in big tubs, bring them into my house. If you could give them bottom heat, that would be ideal, but I grow so many of these dahlias that there's no way I could ever find enough bottom heat for all that. So I just stack them up in big tubs, bring them into my house where it's warm, because at this point they don't need any light. Light does nothing for these plants at this point. All they want to do is be warm to start those shoots going. And then once I see a shoot come out of the ground, come out of the soil, that's when I will go give it some water, and then I move it out to a temporary greenhouse that I set up just for hardening off plants and growing dahlias for a bit in the spring, which just gets them going there. That way I don't have to acclimate them, and there's plenty of light out there, and I've got so many of them that growing them under grow lights or something like that is not an option for me. Stick them out there, and then they're basically hardened off, they're ready to go, and then I will plant them out in the garden at the end of May, or whenever I'm able to get in there when the soil is warm enough to do that. A couple of growing tips for dahlias. They do want consistent moisture. They're very much like a tomato in that way. They want consistent moisture. They don't need a lot of it, but they just want it consistently. And it is recommended that you fertilize your dahlias about once a month or so. The key is make sure it's a low nitrogen fertilizer. If you can find a fertilizer that has no nitrogen in it whatsoever, that's really the best. A lot of times you might look for something like a bloom fertilizer, might be that. So that's, nitrogen is that first number on the fertilizer. So look for a very low number there, or even 0 for the nitrogen. I will tell you though that many times I forget to fertilize my dahlias, and I feel like I've had great success anyways. So if you've got soil that is really properly amended and you've got good garden soil going on, you might not have to worry so much about the fertilizing. However, dahlia growers will tell you that you should do that, and they are hungry plants, because keep in mind they're putting up big, some of these are putting up huge flowers. And my last tip for growing dahlias is stake the big ones before you think you need to. And I tell you this from experience, because I can't tell you the number of times that I've looked at a plant and thought, well, that doesn't need to be staked, and then you come out the next day and your whole stem with that gorgeous flower on it is broken off, and you've lost it. So do stake. It's actually great if you can stake them at the time that you plant them. That's really best that way. The stake's in there. You're not going to have to worry about jamming that stake through the tuber, because you know exactly where it is. And then it's all set to go, and you're not going to lose any dahlias because they flop over. So that's all you need to do. They are, oh, in full sun. I mean, put your dahlias in full sun. They aren't gonna, you can probably push it to part sun, but they're not gonna like anything beyond that. So that's one thing you can't fudge a lot on with dahlias. Beyond that, dahlias are not difficult flowers to grow at all. There's some fussing around when you're trying to overwinter them, but beyond that, they're actually really easy flowers to grow. And to me, they're one of the most beautiful flowers. And particularly if you like cutting big bouquets from your garden, you can't get better than dahlias. So that's how I start my dahlias ahead of time to get a little jump on the season here in my cold zone. And you might want to try that this year, or if you live in a warmer zone, you know, apply these same principles to just planting them in the ground. But I hope you give growing dahlias a try this year. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.